Morning. The committee will come to order. We're pleased to welcome the 25th Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter. This is Mr. Carter's first appearance before our subcommittee as Secretary, although we know him well from his many years of service to our nation. We also welcome back General Martin Dempsey. Thank you for your services, 4 years as the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You're over close to, 41 years in the U.S. Army, your Jersey City roots, and obviously your attendance at our one of our premier military academies, West Point. I also welcome Dr. Michael McCord, who's making his first appearance before the subcommittee as the Comptroller of the Department. Gentlemen, welcome. As you know, our committee has, as always, two principal responsibilities. First, to provide the Department of Defense and the intelligence community with the resources they need to carry out their missions to protect America and our allies. The second responsibility is to ensure that our men and women in uniform, every one of whom has volunteered to serve, have the resources they need to defend our nation and support their families. As we gather here this morning, both of those tasks are becoming more difficult. The threat environment facing America is complicated and more dangerous. The fiscal challenges are worse than ever before. As the Budget Control Act of 2011 remains the law of the land, we find ourselves staring down the barrel of renewed tight budget caps. Mr. Secretary and General Dempsey, I completely agree that the BCA needs to be modified to avoid dramatic consequences and long-term negative impacts on our military capability. But unless and until the law is changed, this committee has no choice but to draft our bill to comply with the BCA caps, at least $37 billion below the President's budget request. So we'll need to work very closely together to ensure the funding you are appropriated is sufficient to take care of our uniformed and civilian personnel, maintain your readiness at the highest possible level, and sustain our technological advantages. The decision this committee makes will help set the foundation for America's defense capabilities, not just for fiscal year 2016, but for many years to come. While there is much public focus and concern on the BCA and the sequester, choices are made or not made by our Commander-in-Chief every day that have a direct bearing on our defense and intelligence posture and this defense budget. After all, sequester did not create ISIS, that depraved barbaric force that grew as a result of our premature withdrawal from Iraq. Sequester is not responsible for over 200,000 deaths in Syria, millions of refugees and displaced families throughout the Middle East. Sequester had nothing to do with the President's State of the Union declaration that the United States is no longer on a war footing. Sequester did not loosen sanctions on Iran and let that nation advance to the brink of a game-changing nuclear weapons capability. Sequester did not prompt Vladimir Putin to annex Crimea and send his troops to fight alongside separatists in eastern Ukraine. Sequester did not lead us to liberate Libya and then turn our back while the country devolved into a dangerous breeding ground for terrorists. Mr. Secretary General Dempsey, we look forward to your comments and informative question and answer period. In addition to your assessments of the Middle East and Persian Gulf, the subcommittee also wants to hear your views on the conventional and unconventional threats posed by China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and non-state actors, aka terrorist groups such as ISIL, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and others, and the costs of meeting those challenges. In closing, Mr. Secretary, we must make certain that in meeting the demands of the fiscal austerity, we do not leave any question about our will and our ability to defend ourselves and our interests around the world. Without objection, your written statements will be entered into the record, so feel free to summarize your statements this morning. With that, let me turn to my good friend Pete Viscoski, the ranking member, for any comments he may wish to make.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I want to ask unanimous consent that my entire statement be entered into the record.
Consider it done.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I do appreciate you holding the hearing. Defense Secretary Carter and Undersecretary McCord, we do look forward to having your testimony before the subcommittee today, the first time in your current roles. General Dempsey, I do understand, as the chairman alluded to, today may be your last official appearance before the Defense Subcommittee as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Would point out that your steady leadership has helped the services navigate some very turbulent years. And I and all of us thank you for your dedication and sacrifice both you and your family have made over the last 40 years. The crux of the challenge facing the subcommittee will undoubtedly be reconciling the department's fiscal year budget request for 16 with the significantly lower spending caps established by the Budget Control Act. While I'm sure we will see attempts at finding relief from the constraints of BCA, I do not anticipate a significant change between now and when this bill is marked up, as there appears to be insurmountable obstacles blocking every path forward. Since it is our role to prepare legislation according to the law as it is today, I believe the subcommittee will be required to mark at a level that is $33.3 billion below the President's request. In order to accomplish that feat, having open lines of communication between the Department and Congress will be imperative. We need to make difficult and deliberate decisions to prioritize the limited resources available in order to minimize the risk to our nation and the men and women in uniform. One area where we may need to find a consensus is the balance between readiness and modernization. It is my opinion, and my opinion alone, that the Department's budget favors modernization over readiness. This is best evidenced by the proposed growth in procurement and research and development versus more modest percentage increases in the accounts that tie directly to the readiness of forces. Last week, we heard from the Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force leadership regarding their ongoing struggles to recover readiness following the sequestration of 2013. For example, the Secretary of the Air Force, Secretary James, stated more than half of our combat air forces, half, are not sufficiently ready for a high-end fight. Further, the service leaders warned that returning to the BCA caps in fiscal year 2016 will only exacerbate the readiness deficit. Additionally, in the fiscal year 2016 budget request, the Department of Defense again proposes some significant initiatives to stem the growth in personnel-related expenses. These include proposed changes to basic allowances for housing, the commissary benefits, and TRICARE. In past years, with a few exceptions, these proposals have gained very little traction within the Congress. Again, my opinion only, I hope that as more members of Congress accept the actuality of limited resources, that we will be able, Congress, to seriously consider some of these proposals that you have brought forth, as well as those brought forth by the Military Compensation Retirement Modernization Commission. Congress has a responsibility in this area as well. Finally, I am pleased that the budget sustains funding for financial auditability improvements. I wholeheartedly support the Department's reaching the 2017 goal for auditable financial statements, a tool that will help manage the finite resources that we have. And again, gentlemen, look forward to your testimony. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Visclosky. Ms. Lowy, Ranking Member of the full committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Chairman Frelinghuysen and Ranking Member Visclosky for this hearing. Also, I want to join my chairman in welcoming incoming Secretary Carter, General Dempsey, Undersecretary McCord, and the rest of our distinguished guests. The President's FY16 budget submission for the Department of Defense is roughly $33 billion above the BCA level. Some of my friends on the other side of the aisle have stated their opposition to the funding levels and revenue portions of the budget request. I would respond that after this committee has cut $1.5 trillion in discretionary spending, excluding sequestration, are we really unwilling to close tax loopholes in order to invest more in transportation, infrastructure, education, job training, biomedical research, and other R&D efforts, and the military? The world is quickly changing, requiring our continued commitment to the defense of this nation, our allies around the world. Currently, we are fully committed in multiple operations on various continents. However, we struggle to provide funding that reflects this commitment. We face a determined and expanding presence with ISIS, decisions in Ukraine, policy decisions combating cyber threats, and training and assistance missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Many of the personnel issues we faced in the past are still a concern for the military. Although sexual assault numbers seem to be improving, the overall problem still exists. We have several recommendations on force structure changes and military compensation reforms to consider. We're still working to prevent suicides, integrate women into combat positions, and obtain a fully interoperable electronic healthcare record system between DoD and the VA. I must tell you, I know there are major challenges in the world today, but I cannot understand how it's taken this long for DoD and the VA to get together. And as I understand, sir, you're still out, you still haven't selected a system, and why you can't use the same system as the VA is beyond me. The private sector, as I understand it, my conversations with many people, you get a chip, you go on to your next job, your whole record is there. We charge you with the responsibility of fighting wars, yet you can't get together with our own VA system and do it expeditiously. And yes, I understand. You're about to make a decision. It's only been a year or more, but members of this committee and this Congress are very frustrated with the fact that this can't proceed more efficiently and expeditiously. The results of these efforts will ensure quality of life for service members and their families, whether they stay in the military or transition to civilian life. So let me conclude by saying, fiscal uncertainty aside, we owe it to our military, the nation, and our allies to ensure we prioritize and fund the most critical defense-related budget items. So thank you very much for being here. We look forward to hearing your testimony.
Thank you, Ms. Lowe. Before turning the floor over to the Secretary, let me associate myself with your comments on the medical records. The Department of Defense is about to embark on a multi-year $13 billion contract, and I think all the committee members feel that that contract needs to be integrated with whatever the VA has and is looking forward to investing in itself. Mr. Secretary, good morning. Thank you for being with us. Congratulations on your new assignment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, and thank Ranking Member Visklosky for having me here this morning, and thank all the members of the committee for inviting me to be here with you today. While I've had the opportunity to speak with many of you before, this is my first time testifying to this committee as the Secretary of Defense. My care and respect for the men and women of the finest fighting force the world has ever known is as boundless as their skill and dedication. I know this committee shares the same devotion to them and shares responsibility for them and for the defense of our great country. And I hope that my tenure as Secretary of Defense will be marked by partnership with you on their behalf. I'm here to present the President's budget for the Department of Defense for fiscal year 2016. And since I've been in the job for exactly 2 weeks and a day, it's plain that I did not have a role in shaping this budget. But I have studied it carefully, and I'm fully prepared to answer your questions about it and to work with you to find common ground where you have concerns. Most importantly, I strongly support the President in requesting a defense budget above the artificial caps of the Budget Control Act, that is, above so-called sequester levels, next year and in the years thereafter. I share the President's desire to find a way forward that upholds the fundamental principles behind the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013. And I support the President's commitment to vetoing any bill that locks in sequestration, because to do otherwise would be both unsafe and wasteful. Before I turn to the budget to explain what I mean by that, allow me to share some observations from my short time on the job, observations that help reinforce my testimony here. Shortly after I was sworn in, I spoke to the people of the Department of Defense, military, civilian, and contractor, and I told them I had 3 commitments as Secretary of Defense. The first is to them and their families, to their safety, their welfare, and their effectiveness, and equally to those who came before them and will come after them. The second commitment is to assist the President as he makes difficult choices about how to defend the country in a turbulent world, as the Chairman has affirmed, and then to carry out those decisions where they involve the use of military force. And the third commitment is to the future, to make sure our military remains the very best in an ever-changing world, amid fast-moving technological and commercial change, and as we seek to attract new generations to the wonderful mission of national security in our department. Because of those commitments, I traveled at the end of my first week on the job to Afghanistan to visit our troops and commanders, and also the leaders of Afghanistan and some of their military leaders. I wanted to assess the conditions on the ground there as we enter a new phase of our long campaign and as we carry out the transition to an enduring presence that will ensure, as the President says, that our progress in Afghanistan sticks. Next, I traveled to Kuwait, where I met with the Emir before convening senior American diplomats and military leaders from throughout the region, ambassadors from several countries, our commanders from Central Command, European Command, Africa Command, and Special Operations Command, and the commanders of the campaign in Iraq and Syria against ISIL. I wanted to hear directly from them about the complex political and military situation in the entire region, and about the best approaches to leveraging U.S. leadership of the broad coalition combating this ugly scourge. And this morning, I'd be pleased to discuss these challenges or any others in addition to the defense budget. But the point is that in these regions of the world, just as in the Asia-Pacific, in Europe, and elsewhere, it is America's leadership and America's men and women in uniform who stand between disorder and order, who stand up to malicious and destabilizing actors, while standing with those who believe with us in a more secure, just, and prosperous future for all our children. But this Congress will determine whether our troops can continue to do so. The administration is proposing to increase the defense budget in line with the projections submitted to Congress last year. By halting the decline in defense spending imposed by the Budget Control Act, the President's budget would give us the resources we need to execute our nation's defense strategy. But, and I want to be clear about this, under sequestration, which is set to return in 211 days, our nation will be less secure. Mr. Chairman, as you and your colleagues have said, sequestration threatens our military readiness. And that was a point that Ranking Member Visklowski made very accurately and pointedly a few moments ago. Threatens our military's readiness, the size of our warfighting forces, the capabilities of our air and naval fleets, and ultimately the lives of our men and women in uniform. The Joint Chiefs have said the same before the Congress, and they could not have been more clear in their assessment of how sequestration would damage our national security. The great tragedy is that this corrosive damage to our national security is not the result of objective factors or logic or reason. It's not that we have some new breakthrough in military technology or a novel strategic insight that somehow provides the same security for a smaller budget. It's not that sequester is forced upon us by an economic emergency or a dire recession that makes taking grave security risks absolutely necessary. It's surely not the case that the world has suddenly become more stable, or that America has less to do to keep it safe, allowing us to take a peace dividend of some kind. It's not even that these cuts solve the nation's overall fiscal challenges, because the sad math is that they are large and sudden enough to damage defense, but fail to resolve our long-term fiscal issues and the real drivers of the deficit and debt. So sequester was not the result of objective factors. Sequester is purely the fallout of political gridlock. Its purpose was to compel prudent compromise on our long-term fiscal challenges, a compromise that never came. This has been compounded in recent years because the Defense Department has suffered a double whammy, the worst of both worlds, that has coupled mindless sequestration with constraints on our ability to reform. We need your help with both. I know that Chairman Frelinghuysen, Ranking Member Visklosky, and others on this committee are as dedicated to reform as I am. We at the Pentagon can and must do better with getting value for the defense dollar. Taxpayers have trouble comprehending, let alone supporting the defense budget, when they hear about cost overruns, insufficient accounting and accountability, needless overhead, excess infrastructure, and the like. There are significant savings to be found across DoD, and we're committed to pursuing them. But at the same time, I must note that in the past several years, painful but necessary reforms proposed by DoD, reforms involving elimination of overhead and unneeded infrastructure, retirement of older force structure, and reasonable adjustments in compensation, have been denied by Congress at the same time that sequestration looms. I will work with Congress to resolve concerns and find common ground in these matters, but we must have your support. Sequester cuts don't help us achieve meaningful reform. In fact, the nature of sequester frequently leads to waste, as for example, when it forces a reduction in contract production rates, driving up unit costs. If confronted with sequestration-level budgets and continued obstacles to reform, I do not believe that we can simply keep making incremental cuts while maintaining the same general set of objectives that have anchored our defense strategy. We would have to change the shape and not just the size of our military, significantly affecting parts of our defense strategy. We cannot meet sequester with further half measures. As Secretary of Defense, I will not send our troops into a fight with outdated equipment, inadequate readiness, or ineffective doctrine. But everything else is on the table, including parts of our budget that have long been considered inviolate. This may lead to decisions that no Americans, including members of Congress, want us to make. I'm not afraid to ask the difficult questions, but if we're stuck with sequestration's budget cuts over the long term, our entire nation will have to live with the answers. So instead of sequestration, I urge you to embrace the alternative, building the force of the future, powerful enough to underwrite our strategy, equipped with boldly new technology, leading in domains like cyber and space, attracting and retaining the best Americans to our mission, being lean and efficient throughout this enterprise, and showing resolve to friends and potential foes alike. I think we can all agree that the world in 2014 was more complicated than anyone could have predicted. Given today's security environment, the President's proposed increase in defense spending over last year's budget is responsible and it's prudent. I hope we can come together behind a long-term budget approach that dispels sequester and provides stability rather than doing this 1 year at a time. I hope we can again unite behind what our great nation should and must do to protect our people and make a better world. And I hope we can provide our magnificent men and women of the Department of Defense, who make up the greatest fighting force the world has ever known, what they need and what they fully deserve. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. General Dempsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Visclosky, and the distinguished members of this panel and subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to provide you an update on the armed forces and to discuss our defense budget for 2016. I wasn't prepared, I haven't even confronted the fact that this might be my last appearance before this committee. So let me thank you for the very kind words, and it has been a tumultuous 4 years with many challenges. But I've been surrounded by a great teammate of service chiefs, service secretaries, secretaries of defense, and the great civilians that support us in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And I can't think of another time in our history when I would rather have served, because I think service is a blessing, and in particular when you feel like you can actually make a difference for our country and for the men and women who volunteer to serve. So thank you very much for the kind words. Our military remains strong today, but we can't and must not take that for granted. I'll actually abbreviate my statement. I was doing that while you were speaking, Mr. Secretary, by deferring the many security challenges we face to the Q&A, to the question and answer. And I'll just jump straight to a brief comment on the budget itself. The global security environment is as uncertain as I've seen in my 40 years of service. And we're at a point where our national aspirations are at genuine risk of exceeding our available resources. We've heard the Congress of the United States loud and clear, and as it has challenged us to become more efficient and to determine the minimum essential requirements that we need as an armed force to do what the nation asks us to do. PB-16 is that answer. In my judgment, this budget represents a responsible combination of capability, capacity, and readiness. It's what we need to remain at the bottom edge of manageable risk to our national defense. There is no slack left. We've been working on the slack for the last 3 years. There is no margin of error nor any buffer built into strategic surprise. Funding lower than PB-16 and a lack of flexibility, and what I mean by that is the reform measures that we have, internal reform measures that we have proposed. By the way, this group of chiefs has made more proposals on changing pay compensation, healthcare, infrastructure, and weapons systems than any in history. It's been a difficult journey and a difficult debate on doing that. It's been difficult to communicate to our men and women serving why we have to do it, but we've taken that responsibility on and have made several recommendations to you on internal reforms, and we certainly need both the top-line increase that the President has provided, but just as importantly, the reforms that we've requested. If we get anything lower than PB-16, or if we don't get some of the flexibility that we've baked into the budget, then we'll have to change our strategy. Now, that may be a bit abstract to you. I'd be happy to unpack that a bit today. We think our strategy is what the nation needs, and if we can't execute it, what I'll be saying to you is that we're not doing what the nation needs us to do. For the past 25 years, the U.S. military has secured the global commons. We've been very effective at deterring adversaries. We've reassured our allies, and we've responded to conflict and crises by maintaining our presence abroad. It's been our strategy to shape the international security environment by our forward presence and by building relationships with regional partners. In general terms, 1/3 of our force is generally deployed, 1/3 is just back, and 1/3 is getting ready to go. Of necessity, certain of our capabilities have actually deployed with half of the available capability forward and the other half back recovering. This, as you know, puts a significant strain on those who serve in those particular specialties and their families. Sequestration will fundamentally and significantly change the way we deploy the force and shape the environment. We'll be almost 20% smaller when all is said and done from where we started, and our forward presence will be reduced by about 1/3. We'll have less influence, and we'll be less responsive. Conflict will take longer to resolve, and it will be more costly in both dollars and in casualties. In an age when we are less certain about what will happen next, but we're very certain that it'll happen more quickly, we will be further away and less ready than we need to be. Simply stated, sequestration will result in a dramatic change in how we protect our nation and how we promote our national security interests. Mr. Chairman and members of this committee, our men and women in uniform are performing around the globe, as the Secretary said, with extraordinary courage, character, and professionalism. We owe them and their families clarity and, importantly, predictability on everything from policy to compensation, health care, equipment, training, and readiness. Settling down uncertainty. And by the way, the reason I'm so passionate about asking you to settle down our budget and to do, as the Secretary said, get us out of this cycle of 1 year at a time, is that I'd like to have at least one variable in my life fixed. And I think the one that's most likely to have an opportunity to be fixed is, in fact, our resources. But in any case, if we do that, if we successfully settle down our budget uncertainty, get some flexibility and some time to absorb the reductions we've already been given, then I think we'll keep the right people, who are really our decisive edge, in the all-volunteer force and maintain the military that the American people deserve and frankly expect. I'm very grateful for the continued support of that our men and women in uniform receive from you and the Congress of the United States, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Respectfully, it may be implied in my opening statement is clarity of foreign and military policy. I think members who looked at their Wall Street Journal headline yesterday, Iran backs Iraqi offensive as Pentagon steers clear. I know you were before the Senate yesterday, and I have to say one of the untold stories is that not only did we leave a vacuum for ISIS, but we have Iran in Iraq in a way that most Americans are totally unaware of. We have a public commitment to train and equip a complex, group of Sunnis and Shiites, and what are the Iranians doing with the Quds force? They've trained and equipped and motivated thousands of people, and there's a strong likelihood as they move on to Crete and perhaps on Mosul that you could have a total disintegration of the entire country. So there is a mixture of policy and resources. And so I do have a few questions. Are we neutral with Iran these days, considering the crimes that have been committed against humanity, not only our own? Is anybody ever going to hold Iran accountable? I know we're keeping our distance physically from them in Baghdad. Have we ceded most of the governance of Iraq to Iranians' choices? It's a good question. And will the military operations that are undergoing, which we are watching, divide the country and require us in some ways to spend more of our resources? So I'd like to talk about just a case in point. We can point to what's happening in Ukraine, our evacuation from Yemen, the terrible mess in Libya, but a lot of it is associated with a lack of clarity as to where we are, what our leadership position is. Can we focus on Iran? Mr. Secretary.
Surely. First of all, Mr. Chairman, let me say that I absolutely share your concern about the role of Iran in Iraq and the wider region. But just to focus on Iraq for a moment, what created the vacuum and the opportunity for ISIL in Iraq was the reemergence of sectarianism. And I think that going forward, what we're trying to support, including in our train and equip, is a strong multi-sectarian government of Iraq. That is our objective. Now, if you ask me, is that a sure thing, I would say no, and I would say that is our objective, that's our hope, that's the only thing that can bring stability to Iraq, and I think it's the fastest route to the defeat of ISIL.
So someone would suggest, I say this respectfully again, that the Shiites and the Sunnis, that there was, you didn't have to go too below the skin to find the resurgence. I mean, the killings that were perpetrated in the period of time after we left Iraq would never be forgotten by those who those in the country who were killed or maimed or kidnapped or slaughtered.
I
Yeah.
I completely agree with you. And sectarianism is one of the things that concerns me very much. And of course, it's the root of the Iranian presence in Iraq. And to get to around the region, you mentioned several other places where Iranian influence is concerning to us, and we need to watch very closely. So I just share your concern
And about the only area that we have to look for funds is what's called the Overseas Contingency Operations, OCO. Used to be called the War on Terrorism, now it's the OCO Fund. That's the only area where we have the flexibility to meet all these various challenges and enemies.
Yes, and thanks in part to this committee, OCO has been a major source now for many years of the budgetary flexibility that we need to respond to new contingencies. So this year we're asking for OCO funding for the campaign against ISIL. We're asking OCO funding to continue the campaign in Afghanistan and make sure the success there sticks. Again, not a sure thing, but something that we need to make sure sticks. And you mentioned Ukraine as well, the European Reassurance Initiative, all those.
Well, the issue here, my point is, in turn to Mr. Viclossi, what are our plans? I mean, hope is not a plan. We hope things go well in Iraq and other parts of the world. Things have not gone so well, and people are sort of looking to us to see whether we're going to step in and provide some degree of leadership. Mr. Viclossi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First comment I would make, and both Secretary and General Dempsey also alluded to it in referring back to my opening statement, Secretary, in your prepared statement, you say at the same time Congress talking about the need to make decisions, particularly in the arena of personnel issues, has sometimes sought to protect programs that DOD has argued are no longer needed or require significant reform. Again, I agree with your assertion. I wouldn't suggest that the department is always right in every characteristic. On the other hand, we simply cannot continue down this road as far as the allocation of your resources, whether it be CA level or we're $33 billion above. So certainly agree with that. Mr. McCord, I think my first question would be directed to you. I was very pleased to see that the Statement of Budgetary Resources for the Marine Corps received an unqualified opinion. And as I do every year when the Comptroller appears, ask about the goal of achieving audible results for the department by 2017 and wonder where we are in that regard.
Thank you, Congressman. We've taken a big step in December. We went on contract, the Army, Navy, and the Air Force did, to follow in the steps of the Marines to do the Statement of Budgetary Resources, Stage 1, which is called a Schedule of Budgetary Activities. So we have gone from years of thinking about it, planning for it, to actually being in the game, having auditors on the ground who are now working with our military departments to tell them where we're up to par and where we're not up to par. And I'm not sure we're going to like all the answers that we hear from that, but it's a big change to actually be doing it as opposed to planning for it. So that is really the big thing that we are working with our military departments on this year, is actually being under audit for not just the Marines, as important as it is, but the much bigger other three departments, other three services.
Appreciate it very much. Just one other question, Mr. Chairman, and that is on the nuclear component of the Department of Defense. The focus of much of the work that we do in relationship to the Department of Defense are from threats from powers we would not consider major powers, as lethal and as destructive as they are. And as we proceed, if you would, with the issue of modernization, you look at some of the issues that the Air Force has confronted as far as their bomber fleet, as far as the control of the silos. Are some of the triads, are we in danger of some hollowing out of them? And is there reconsideration, given limited resources, as to whether or not a triad is what is still called for in the future?
Thank you, Congressman. The Joint Chiefs and I remain committed of the belief, and it's our advice, that the triad remains an essential factor in our nuclear deterrence. And as you are well aware, I think the former Secretary of Defense conducted or directed a review of the nuclear enterprise, because over the course of time, when we were focused on, as you said yourself, on non-state actors, that enterprise had, we failed to take appropriate attention to it in terms of its leader development, its infrastructure, and its modernization. You'll see in this budget, of course, that at the end of that review, the Secretary went forward to the President and requested additional top line for that very reason, and the President agreed to provide it. So if you're asking me about nuclear strategy, by the way, the man sitting to my left probably knows more about nuclear issues than anyone in the government. But from a military perspective, we remain convinced that the triad is the appropriate formulary for the nuclear enterprise.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Chairman Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, welcome to the hearing. Mr. Secretary, congratulations, condolences on your elevation. We wish you all the best in the world.
Thank you, Chairman.
Let me briefly ask you about, I think it's been touched on already. I'm sorry I'm late to the hearing. We've had two others. About the electronic record system, medical records. People have heard me tell this before, and I apologize for that, but a young veteran came to me a few years ago from my district. He was severely injured in Iraq, lost one eye. The other eye was severely disabled, but he could still see. So he's discharged. He goes to this eye begins to act up as well, so he goes to the VA hospital in Lexington, and they do nothing because they couldn't get his records from the military, from DOD, from the operations that took place in Germany after he was injured. So they were afraid to operate because of what they didn't know was in there. So he lost his eye, simply because the VA could not get the medical records of his service in the military. That's completely unacceptable. To cause a young man to lose the sight of his eyes because of bureaucratic ineptitude. Now, we've been on a tear on this committee now for a few years to straighten that out. DOD says, oh, yes, we're going to fix it. VA says, oh, yes, we're going to fix it. But they still keep to their own systems. And for the life of me, I can't understand why you can't interoperate between VA and DOD on medical records of all things, because people's lives are depending on it. Could you help me out with that, Mr.?
Well, I can help you out to the following extent. I completely share your frustration with this. I don't know this particular case, but the way I think about it is a soldier, sailor, airman, and Marines is there's only one soldier, but there are two cabinet departments. They shouldn't have to worry about that.
Exactly.
They shouldn't have to worry about what we're doing here in Washington and so forth. So to get to I'm familiar with this situation from previous service, but I really want to work with Bob McDonald, our chairman of Veterans Affairs. I think it's very important that they not see two different cabinet departments. And with respect to the electronic health records, we can make them interoperable. This is not something that isn't done every day out in our society. There are lots of medical systems that merge. one bought by the other. It happens every day all over the country. It's a very dynamic part of our economy. It's a large piece of our economy, and there are many, many medical record systems that need to be merged. So this is something that can be done and needs to be done so that there aren't cases like the one you cite. There's no technological barrier to making the two electronic health records interoperable.
Well, you know, Mr. Secretary, I thank you for that sentiment. But I've heard that for 8 years now from different secretaries, VA secretaries as well as DOD secretaries. And nothing happens. And we've poured money into this. How much money have we put into it?
It's been money.
Since June of 2008?
How many billions? Several billion. At least $2 billion.
So we're pouring money at the problem. Why can't we get it fixed?
I think we can get it fixed. I think we have to get it fixed, and I share your frustration about all those years and all of those dollars. And the work that's been done needs to be leveraged into a final solution here. It doesn't have to be the case that VA and DOD have the same system. They have to have interoperable systems. And again, this is something that the private sector wrestles with all the time, and there's no reason why we can't do it. And I just come back to the fundamental starting point, which is it's unfair to the service member to make them have to worry about how our government is organized.
I thank you, Mr. Secretary, and we will stay in touch with you on this if you would mind.
Absolutely. You know, I invite you to, and believe me, I'll pay attention to it.
Less than a year ago, the chairman and I called a meeting between the DOD secretary at the time and the VA secretary at the time, both of whom have since left. And they promised us immediate, speedy action. And I've yet to see one marble roll down the hill. So I know how tough this issue apparently is to the bureaucracies to give up a little bit of their turf to get a common system. But I have confidence that you'll do this, Mr. Secretary.
Shouldn't be tough, Chairman, and it's a fair question, and I'll make sure I work it with you.
Let me switch gears completely and talk about AUMF. 2 weeks ago, the President called on Congress to issue a formal authorization for the use of military force against the Islamic State, including authorizing the use of armed forces in the fight against ISIL, but with certain limitations, reporting requirements, and for only 3 years. Specifically, the draft would, quote, not authorize the use of United States armed forces during offensive ground combat operations, end of quote. What is enduring?
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me just say, as I understand that there's going to be a debate over the terms of the AUMF, and I just want to say something about where I come from on that as Secretary of Defense. There are two things that are important to me in the AUMF, and the first one is that it gives us the flexibility we need to defeat this opponent. That's the most important thing. And the second important thing to me is that the AUMF that emerges from this discussion be something that is widely supported so that our people who are conducting that fight see a country united behind them. That's terribly important. And so those are the two things that are most important to me. You mentioned the 3-year item. That is not something that I would have deduced from the Department of Defense's necessities, the campaign's necessities, or our obligation to the troops. I think it has to do with the political calendar in our country. I understand that. That's a constitutional issue wherein the executive branch and the legislative branch share responsibility for the conduct of military operations. I wouldn't assure anyone that this will be over in 3 years or that the campaign will be completed in 3 years. The 3 years comes from the fact that there'll be a presidential election in 2 years and so forth, and I respect that. That's not a military or a defense consideration, but I respect it as a constitutional consideration.
Yeah. Do you anticipate putting additional U.S. troops on the ground in Iraq or introducing troops to Syria?
I think that with respect to American ground troops, that is a question that will hinge upon what is required for success there. I think the chairman has said, and I'll let him speak for himself, but I would say the same thing, that we will make recommendations for the character of American assistance to this campaign that guarantee its success, and we'll do that as the need arises, and that's certainly my view. And let me just ask the chairman to.
What you can be assured of, Chairman, is that if the commander on the ground approaches either me or the Secretary of Defense and believes that the introduction of special operations forces to accompany Iraqis or the new Syrian forces or JTACs, these skilled folks who can call in close air support, if we believe that's necessary to achieve our objectives, we will make that recommendation. Back to the AUMF, we believe we have that authority to make that request within the AUMF as it's currently crafted. And I get the question about enduring as well. The word enduring is not a doctrinal term in military lexicon, but I also have a master's degree in English literature from Duke University, and enduring is clearly an expression of the Commander-in-Chief's intent within the document.
Mr. Secretary, at your conference last week at Camp Arfan, reports were that you were seeking a deeper understanding of the strategy. You previously said that you believe the U.S. must rethink its approach to countering terrorism in general, partly in light of the emergence of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Given your concept of the U.S. strategy with regard to countering terrorism, would you please walk the committee through our current strategy and explain whether you've determined that alternatives are necessary?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, I will. Let me do it in three pieces: the Iraq piece, the Syria piece, and the regional or wider. All three of those were part of our discussions last week. That's the reason to have our diplomatic folks and our military folks from the entire region who worked this problem get together. And let me just say right at the beginning, I was so impressed with the wisdom at that table. I mean, you would be very proud, I certainly was, of Team America in that region. And ISIL's obviously a difficult challenge, but our approach to it is in Iraq to work with the Iraqi security forces and the Iraqi government to support a multi-sectarian government in Iraq that can over time reclaim the territory lost to these extremists and drive them out of the country. We were discussing earlier the issue of sectarianism and the problem of sectarianism in Iraq, and I'm not sanguine or casual about that, but that is what we're trying to get the government of a body to pursue, and that is the spirit in which we are working with the Iraqi security forces. On the Syrian side of the border, we are also trying to train and equip moderate Syrian opposition. That is not as large and established an institution as the Iraqi security forces is, nor is it is there a sovereign government there that we're willing to support. On the contrary, the sovereign government of Syria is the government of Bashir Assad, whom we think needs to go. That creates a much more difficult situation wherein we're trying to create a third force that can both combat ISIL and set the conditions for the eventual removal of Bashir Assad. So that's the effort on the Syrian side. In the region as a whole, and this gets to your larger question about the nature of counterterrorism, and the ISIL is now we observe popping up in other places. In fact, I was in Afghanistan and talking to President Ghani there, who's quite concerned about ISIL in Afghanistan. Why? What's going on there? Well, in his telling, and I think this is our understanding as well, there are a lot of extremists and terrorists who are rebranding themselves as ISIL, who previously belonged to other groups, and they find that those groups don't offer them the same inspiration and ardor and radicalism that they crave. Some of these are younger people, and so they're turning to ISIL precisely because of its ugly nature. And so we're seeing that around, and that represents a social media-fueled phenomenon. And I think that that's a new dimension to it that we need to take into account. So I'm sorry to go on so long, but it's obviously a complicated situation and an evolving strategy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Lowy and then Ms. Granger.
Thank you very much. Before I go on to my question, I just hope we have an opportunity to explore another time, and I know Ms. Granger and I are very focused on it in our committee, the social media fueling the terrorists. It seems to me that we should be able to combat that. And I know a new department was created at State, and we have BBG, but somehow we are failing at the task. But on to this committee, and one of the issues that has concerned me is the budget having to do with cybersecurity, $5.5 billion to increase both defensive and offensive cyberspace operation capabilities and funded development of the Cyber Mission Force initiated in FY 2013. This is a much debated concern for DOD and our national security. However, I would like more clarity on the most critical areas of concern, and I would just like to list them quickly, and please comment if you will. If you could describe the primary risks faced by the Department of Defense in the cybersecurity realm. How will DOD work with other organizations, both government and non-government, to share cyber-related information? The budget indicates that measures are taken to increase the capabilities of the Cyber Mission Force initiated in FY 2013. If you can comment on that, the primary elements of the FY 2016 budget in that regard. And is DOD able to recruit and train personnel with the requested skills to develop an effective cybersecurity force? Or do you find yourself in a position where you're subcontracting to the Apples and the Yahoos and the Googles, et cetera? If you could just explain the strength and weaknesses of our current force. And I know we don't have an hour to respond, so please pick each question as you will.
Brief as I possibly can, and then at the risk of extending it even further, perhaps ask Chairman Dempsey, who's also been working on this problem for a long time, to comment. I would say the primary risk is a cyber penetration or attack of our defense systems. We depend abjectly upon our networks working for the effectiveness of our force. We use it all the time. It's what makes our planes, ships, and tanks and all the other tangible equipment work together in on today's battlefield. So we have to have protected networks because that makes all the rest of our military work. And by extension, we have to help protect the country, its critical infrastructure, and its critical safety from cyber attack from outside. So defense is job one, defense within our own department, and playing our role in defense of the country, which gets to your second point. This is a whole of government thing. That's always awkward. It gets back to the health records. You know, you have several different departments involved in this. I believe strongly that that we need to work in the Defense Department with law enforcement, the FBI, which has great capability in this area, with the intelligence community, with Department of Homeland Security, and this gets to your last point, and on this point I'll close, with the private sector. Because the private sector owns and operates a lot of the networks that we work on. It is the source of a lot of the technology that we use and will use in the future. And we need to be open to the information technology industry so that we're using the best of what is there in the Department of Defense. And that gets to your last point, which is people. We are going to have to reach out. This is a domain or a field where, yes, we can train people for the Cyber Mission Force, and we have been training them, but I think we will also continue to draw upon and rely upon the Silicon Valley, so to speak, community to support us in defense, as American high-tech industry has done for decades and decades and decades, supported the Department of Defense and been one of the reasons why we have had the technological lead as a military around the world.
And I'll be brief, but this may be one that you'd be interested in having us come visit you or send a piece of paper over to you. We have, in fact, when Secretary Carter was DepSecDef, he and I collaborated 2 years ago on several initiatives that are coming to fruition. We're building a force within the department of 6,800 to man our cyber security force, and that's in the cybercom. It's also out in our combatant commands. You can think of it this way: we've got a national mission force, if you will, or an organization into which private sector and military can plug, if you will, when cyber events occur. Of course, on the civilian side, they do so voluntarily because we have not achieved legislation on information sharing that incentivizes them to do so. I'll come back to that in a second. And then we have response forces. Think of that as CSI, after-the-fact groups that go out and do the forensics of a cyber attack. You've got some examples of that recently. And then finally, we've got at the regional level in combatant commands, we've got forces that conduct what's essentially cyber reconnaissance, if you will. So we've got layered defense, and we do a pretty good job of protecting our own network. The challenge, of course, for us is that our network is, especially in the unclassified domain, is largely dependent upon the welfare of commercial cyber architecture, which is very vulnerable. And that brings me to the issue of legislation, where 2 years ago we made some recommendations on standards and information sharing unsuccessfully. I think that's been resubmitted recently. In the interim, the President issued an executive order which was very helpful and which we have implemented entirely. And in fact, in some cases, the Secretary has raised the standards. So, for example, we had a problem with quote-unquote, cleared defense contractors who were working for us but who had no incentive to have certain standards of hygiene. And we've closed that gap within the department. The Secretary and our Director of Acquisition, Mr. Kendall, have actually baked into every contract in which we engage now requirements for cyber standards and information sharing. So we can do that internal to the department. But as I sit here today, my concern is that we are dependent upon commercial infrastructure, and it is not bulletproof, I promise you.
All right. We're going to try to tighten it up, Ms. Lowy.
Let me just say thank you very much, and I look forward to getting a more in-depth briefing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Ms. Lowy. Ms. Granger.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, you and General Dempsey both have talked about sequestration. I'm going to tell you, I hate the thought of it. I think we're in the process of devastating our military. But the reason we're there is because of enormous frustration And I thought as we started talking about the VA and DOD and what we've asked to happen and it hasn't happened, and that frustration of not being able to move ahead, instead continuing spending, spending, and spending is what got us to this, to the process of sequestration. I talked to Secretary Panetta personally several times and said, you must speak out and explain to people what this is going to do to our defense. And he said, it'll never happen, and so I'm not going to do that. It will never happen. And I think most of us thought it'll never happen, and here it is. I listened so carefully, Mr. Secretary, to your opening remarks. And what you said, and given specifically, is we can find the reforms. We shouldn't just cut and leave us without the money for cybersecurity, for instance, without the money for research and development. That's what'll happen. I mean, we'll save personnel, we'll save what we can. You say instead, do it the right way. You have, sometimes there's a person for the time. And your history and what you've done, your career, you can do that because you've seen how it's put together. You're in a unique position to say, here's what we need to do. And it will take over several years. It's not going to be done in the first year. I would beg you to be the person that says, tear up that president's budget because it assumes that there's no sequestration. And to us, stop what you're doing as we're designing a budget that follows the law and sequestration is enacted. And instead, you work, and we're doing it right now. The two men to my right, the chair of Appropriations, the chair of Appropriations Defense, the chair of the Budget Committee, and the leadership in the House. I plead with you to say, we can do this a different way, and we can do the savings, and we can look ahead. I can't believe that we're going to do this when the world is so dangerous, and you certainly know that, General. We've listened to everyone who's appeared before this committee, and all you have to do, you can't turn on the television any night that it's not just really a horror story, and I'm not exaggerating. So with your background, please do that. Give us another way forward. We really can prepare for the future, meet our risks, but take those things that don't work, like the medical records, which is so simple if you're committed to do it. But look at all the rest of it. You've been in acquisition for years, and you know what we spend. You know if it took for the V-22, if it took over 20 years, well, you know that's the wrong way to do it. But what we're doing is we're cutting budgets, and then we're saying to the military, we're not going to leave you any flexibility just to do what's right and what we need to have done. So it's not so much a question as I beg you, please, to do that. We've got to be safe from ourselves. And if you would like to respond, you can. If not, you can say we'll move on.
I very much appreciate the spirit of the question. I promise you that when it comes to reform and waste in the defense budget, there's no one more committed to eliminating that than I. And with respect to flexibility, there I would simply say I need your help. We all need your help because we have asked for flexibility now in past years in certain areas that I know are painful and have had that denied. We need the support of Congress. At the end of the day, the power of the purse resides here. I know that we only propose a budget and that you will make the final decisions. And the last thing I'd hope is that we can discuss our strategy as well. We tried to put this budget together beginning with what the country needed rather than with the history of recent years or budget discussions and so forth, but instead be strategy-driven. And I think that's an important principle, that we put what the country needs first. The many problems that the chairman has noted, the complicated world we live in, and what our people actually need to succeed. Start there and deduce the budget that we need from that. And
We're gonna go right to Ms. McCollum. Thank you, Ms. Granger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we're going to get a chance to hear some more about this. I support the president's budget. It ends sequestration, and it's paid for. And if Congress really chooses to end sequestration, we can do that. We made it the law of the land. We can unmake it the law of the land. We've heard from some members here quoting a statement from Admiral Mullen, who said in 2011 that I believe the single biggest threat to our national security is our debt. I also believe we have the responsibility to eliminate that threat. So I have a question for each one of you gentlemen. General Dempsey, when you wake up in the morning, do you consider our nation's debt our single biggest threat to our national security today? Or does that trump ISIL, Iran, North Korea, or Russia, and threats in your mind currently?
No, it does not.
And before we were having a conversation on what we need to do with our defense budget, I want to be clear that even though I believe in miracles, it's becoming very clear to me that the chairman has stated that the Budget Control Act funding levels will be the law of the land. Now, as I said earlier, I support the president's framework of his budget, and it's paid for. But what I don't support is lifting sequestration for defense and not doing it for the other parts of our national security, a quality education, good health care, and that our military men and women and all of us depend upon. So I'm kind of paraphrasing what you said, Mr. Secretary, and I agree with you that every time Congress rejects an opportunity for the department to save money by closing excess facilities, and I have a recent article that says you have 25% of bigger, you've got a huge footprint that you need to get rid of with excess facilities. When we fail to terminate outdated weapons that you have put forward to Congress or to make compensation reforms, we force you to go back and cut modernization, readiness, or personnel. So could you please maybe point out to us why it's important, especially with BRAC, that we're not having you carry excess facilities that no private sector business would carry on their books, for example, and what this glut really means to you with the weapon systems and that about moving forward, because we have to make some hard choices, not just you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you.
thank you. You've stated it very, very clearly, Congresswoman. We do have excess capacity. And it is true that in the private sector, a continuing effort to cut costs and lean out and operation is just part of life, and it's part of competitive success. And here, of course, there's only one Defense Department in the country, so we're competing with ourselves to be more excellent and be more economical. And we do believe that we have excess capacity. That's one of the reasons why we've asked for help with BRAC and other things from the Congress. And we understand why those things are tough, but we've got to move down this road to leaning ourselves out. It's important in order to get the most military capability for the dollar. I think it's also important to show our citizens that we don't ask for funds that are not directly related to the implementation of our strategy.
Mr. Chair, if I could ask Mr. Dempsey, with some of the weapon systems that we keep renewing and reauthorizing, how's that affecting your ability to really do readiness?
When the service chiefs approach me and say that based on their restructuring initiatives that they believe a certain weapon system has exceeded its useful life and the capability is being provided in some other way, I support them. And so when the Chief Staff of the Air Force comes and says, we can provide close air support, I'm a ground guy, I love close air support. When he can provide close air support and not have any gap in capability by retiring the A-10, I support him. And because we hold him accountable for building the force we need, and then he turns it over to the combatant commanders with my help to meet our war plans. So if we're keeping force structure that the service chiefs say is unnecessary to execute our strategy. It just consumes more of the Defense Department's budget, which could and probably should go someplace else.
Thank you, Mr. McCullum. Mr. Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. Mr. Secretary, since you've been on the job for 2 weeks now, I think it'd be appropriate that I initiate you into the group of new Secretaries of Defense about a lingering concern that other members of this subcommittee have heard me express from time to time. That is about the dispersal of our nuclear carrier fleet on the East Coast. Because in 2005, when our carrier fleet went all nuclear, we went from having 2 carrier home ports on the East Coast to only 1. And the Navy decided they would do a study, which they did because this consolidation, what impact it would have on our national security. And after 2.5 years study, they decided that they should disperse these nuclear carriers on the East Coast because, as Secretary Gates had said, it's never been acceptable to have only 1 home port on the West Coast, and it should never be acceptable to do that on the East Coast. And so the Navy set out to create another nuclear home port called Naval Station Mayport. And after 3 years of doing construction projects, they had 2 more to do. The administration halted that program based on all these tight budget constraints. Now, the Navy hadn't changed their mind. They still stand by the goal of strategic dispersal. And so I just wanted you to be aware of that, go through the rite of initiation and hear that early in the job. And I hope you'll take a look at that I don't have any questions about aircraft carriers. I do have questions about submarines. And so very quickly, I wanted to ask you about the Ohio-class submarine replacement program. This year, I think in the budget, there's almost $1.4 billion for some research and development in that program. And I think that's going to be a program that's going to have implications not only for our strategic deterrence capability, but it could have implications for our entire shipbuilding program, because we heard Admiral Grennert last week before the subcommittee talk about the fact that this was a huge priority for him, and he would like to see it carried out, maybe even at the expense of some of the other shipbuilding programs. It would kind of suck all the air, all the money out of that program. And that's concerning, I think, to all of us in terms of the long-term, that 30-year shipbuilding program. But I read, maybe before you got here, before you went on the job, the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund was set up. And I guess that's a fund that recognizes that this submarine replacement program is not just a Navy problem. It's kind of a national defense program. I think they've done that before. And I guess that's good news because that'll help if the DOD is partner with the Navy in that, then they can continue their shipbuilding program. So the question is that deterrence fund was set up, but it hadn't been funded yet. And so I wondered if you could tell the subcommittee what went into the creation of that fund and if you plan on funding that, because if you do, I think that would help us. I think some of the responsibilities the Navy has would be shared with DOD. So could you talk about that, how that's all going to work out? Because I think this whole Ohio-class replacement program is going to be really, really important.
Thank you, Congressman. And I may not know all of the history, so I won't try to recount that because I wasn't there, but I can learn more about that if you'd like to talk about that further. But the fundamental thing you're raising, I completely share your and the Navy's, and I think all my predecessors in this job and this department. We need a safe, secure, and reliable nuclear deterrent. The submarine force is a key leg of the triad. The Ohio-class ages out in the decade of the 20s to 30s. There's nothing we can do about that. It has to do with hull life and the number of times it has contracted and expanded as it submerged and surfaced, so it has to be replaced. These things are expensive. We are trying to get the cost of them down so that it's not as big a bill, but it's still going to be a substantial bill. And you're right, it's so big during the period 2020 to 2030 that it threatens other aspects of the shipbuilding program that the Navy has. That is a big problem for all of us going forward because this is a critical need. The only thing I'd say is how we label the money, it's still the money. It's still part of our defense budget. So if we need to do this, as I believe we do, we need to have the money for it. That is something like everything else in the defense budget, that it shouldn't be in the defense budget in the first place if it's not a national priority, anything, including this. But it is, and this is a national priority. It ought to be funded out of the defense budget. And as I said, it doesn't matter so much how the money is labeled, so much as that the money is there in that decade between 2020 and 2030 so that we can replace this leg of the triad that we really have to replace.
Thank you, Mr. Crenshaw. Thank you, Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Israel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I want to shift the focus to an issue that's been in the news recently, and that is Iran. There has been a lot of talk about Iran's desire to acquire nuclear capability. As Prime Minister Netanyahu stated last night, it's not just the weapon, it is the deliverables. You can have the best pilot in the world, but if the pilot doesn't have a plane, it's just a pilot. And I believe that both in the negotiations and in the public discourse, there hasn't been sufficient attention given to Iran's missile program. And they have a very advanced and developing program. And so I'd like to ask the Secretary in particular, what is your assessment, and the General, what is your assessment of Iran's long-range and intermediate missile program? And what initiatives is the Missile Defense Agency taking to improve the overall performance of ballistic missile defense systems? And then I have another question about the funding in the President's budget for Arrow 2, Arrow 3, Iron Dome, and other programs with respect to Israel.
I'll start, and then Chairman, if you would. This is a long-standing concern, the ever-growing, expanding in numbers and range Iranian ballistic missile program. It is the reason for our very close cooperation with Israel in missile defense, as we cooperate with Israel in everything in defense. This is a very important ally to us, our most important ally in the region. I've been doing this a long time, and we have a relationship that close with the Israeli defense forces, and that needs to continue, and missile defense has to and will continue. And missile defense is an important part of it. You mentioned Iron Dome, you mentioned Arrow, I could mention Patriot, lots of other things that we do together, and we share capability there. It's a long-standing joint effort, and it'll continue. Let me ask the Chairman if he wants to add anything.
No, thanks, Mr. Secretary. So on our side, Congressman, first of all, the ballistic missile capability of Iran is one of about 5 things that cause me great concern from a national security perspective. You know, weapons trafficking, surrogates and proxies, activity in cyber, ballistic missiles, and their nuclear aspirations. On our side, of course, the European phased adaptive approach was an effort to anticipate that at some point they would achieve the ability to, strike either our European allies or the homeland. And so we've got shore-based ballistic missile defenses. We've got ballistic missile defenses afloat with our Aegis cruisers and capable vessels with the SM-3 missile that are essentially geared to intercept these things at different phases of their flight. We've got enormous ballistic missile defense capabilities in the Gulf, in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Qatar, and in the United Arab Emirates. And so we are very much alert to that. I believe there are specific sanctions in place against their ballistic missile program that wouldn't be affected by a nuclear deal. But yeah, we take it really seriously.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Israel. I understand, Mr. Secretary, your staff advises me you might have to take a short break, which might put General Dempsey in the hot seat relative to your recovery path for your?
I wouldn't, I
I'm
wouldn't.
going with him, sir.
There's no way in hell we're going to let you out of here.
I don't want to leave my.
Yeah. We don't want it to be said that you turned your tail and left, but
Chairman,
if you need to take a break.
I appreciate your consideration. I had surgery on the back. There's nothing I can do about it now. What's done is done, and it's a cut that big down the back of my back.
Yeah.
So I think that's why we asked to be able to take a few minutes.
If you
okay
care to
with you,
take a few minutes, that's fine. I'm sure that Mr. Calvert can handle, or hopefully General Dempsey can handle Mr. Calvert.
No, let's just go ahead. That's fine. I'll be fine.
Okay, Mr. Calvert, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, and Secretary and General Dempsey. First, I want to thank you for being here and thank you for your service. I've known you both for a long time, and I know you're up to the challenges. We look forward to continue support your continued support of the men and women in the military. And as has been discussed thoroughly here, unless there's some kind of miracle that happens between the White House and those of us in the House and the Senate, we're going to be operating under the budget caps. And I hope the miracle occurs, but my dad used to say hope is not a planning option. So I think everybody knows what I'm going to talk about today. During your testimony this morning and the testimony we heard last week, the same message was delivered from each of the service chiefs and the secretaries. The President's FY16 budget is the minimum amount of funding required to execute the Defense Strategic Guidance. Anything below that will imperil the military's ability to properly execute the President's strategy. At the same time, the BCA is the law of the land. Until that's changed, we must abide by it, so we have a serious funding gap between the strategy and the law. I do believe there are savings that exist inside the department and should be part of the solution to alleviate the funding pressures on DoD. This is why I want to give you, Mr. Secretary, the mandate that will provide the savings and the authority to properly manage the civilian workforce that focuses attrition, targeted reductions, and places emphasis on performance. Now, there are other reforms, acquisition reform, which I know you've been working on for some time. I think you have a compensation board that has some ideas that I think would help, in retention down the road and help in many ways, and also save money and other ideas. But since 2001, we've cut the active force by 4%. And we've grown the civilian workforce by 15%. Currently, the ratio of civilian employees to active duty personnel is at an all-time high, the highest since World War II. Bringing that ratio down to the historic norm, just the historic norm, would save the department $82.5 billion over 5 years. All these savings could be reinvested right back into the department to help alleviate the impact of the BCA. We've not hesitated to cut our active duty force and cut it too far, in my opinion, and I cannot get a public concession out of anyone at DoD that we should have a proportional right sizing of the civilian workforce. As the new Secretary of Defense, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
You may want to take your break now.
No.
I got it, sir.
I appreciate your consideration, Mr. Chairman. I'll be fine. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm with you. I think we should go after excess wherever we find it in the department, and the civilian workforce, like the military personnel and strength, has to be something that we scrutinize and reduce. And I think we can reduce the civilian workforce, and I'll give you a few reasons why I say that. The civilian workforce grew from about 700,000 to up towards 800,000 in the decade since 9/11, so about 100,000 people. That wasn't just random increase. These were specifically targeted things, which made a lot of sense, like cyber, like our acquisition workforce, like insourcing, if you remember insourcing, which was to bring jobs into the government specifically so that they weren't conducted by contractors and so forth. And so for all these perfectly good reasons, 100,000 people were added. My problem with that is that 100,000 people nobody reached in to the existing force and said, well, let's add these people, but let's meanwhile see whether there aren't some jobs that can be eliminated and reduced. That didn't happen because there was lots of money throughout that decade. Now we need to change that dynamic. And I think that it particularly affects, and I think this is where you were on, the headquarters, I'll call them sort of staff functions. Because remember, most of our civilians, we tend in Washington to think of a civilian DOD employee as someone who sits in a desk in the Pentagon. 85% of our civilians don't live in the Washington metropolitan area. They fix airplanes. They're not sitting at desks. They're repairing ships and so forth. And so they perform essential functions. But where the headquarters staffs are concerned, both military and civilian, I think we can make cuts there, and we have to make cuts there. So I'm with you in that regard.
Would you yield to Mr. Are you
Sure,
there?
I'll be happy to.
No, I thought we might be doing a
I
yield.
just want to make a point that most of the 100,000 additional employees have been brought up since 2008, over 100,000 personnel in the civilian workforce. So, and I'm not talking about depots and wrench turners and folks working in shipyards. And I don't know if I just like to give you the flexibility. I'm not talking about across the board cuts. I'm not talking about that type of activity, but as a private sector guy, you're managing a pretty good sized enterprise, that you ought to be able to have the flexibility to look at performance. That's a part of it, but also be able to buy out contracts and have reductions in force if it's necessary, and give people the opportunity to retire if they choose to. That's what we're talking about, because we need to keep the money in the Pentagon to give it to General Dempsey and to the other service chiefs to keep the strength up and to procure. That's our.
If we could get an answer for Mr. Calvert, a more specific answer, and thank you, Mr. Calvert. We're going to Ms. Capter via the ranking member for a
Just to
two fingers.
follow up, because the gentleman's point, if anyone who is working for the department or any other federal agency, including Congress, ought to have a justification for their existence, is part of the tension as far as whether it's a federal employee or a contractor, the issue of the inherent nature of the governmental work as well?
If a short response, if you would.
Oh, that
Thanks.
is relevant. That's one of the reasons why insourcing was initiated, and that did contribute to the increase in the civilian workforce. And that's a perfectly legitimate reason. But I also believe what was just said, which is we need to be disciplined about this.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Capter, and then Mr. Womack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Dempsey, thank you for your service to our country. And Secretary Carter, thank you so very much for your service as well. I'll just ask my questions, and then I'd appreciate your response. First, General Dempsey, you refer in your statement to heavyweights, middleweights, and other weights. And in terms of the heavyweights in Russia, being at the top of the list. In the event of movement by Russia deeper into Eastern and Central Europe, who's responsible for the command of joint forces in that instance? Last year, Congress directed $75 million through the European Reassurance Initiative for programs, activities, and assistance to support the government of Ukraine. It is my understanding that none of those funds have been obligated. Thus far, could you please explain the status of that funding, the reason for the delay, and how this assistance will be provided moving forward? And is the European Reassurance Initiative the primary mechanism, or is there other funding as well? Then my second arena of questioning deals with ISIS. As I observe the ongoing battle in Tikrit, how do we beat ISIS without defaulting into an alignment with the Shia and Iran? It seems to be a most combustible situation, not just militarily, but politically.
Thank you, Congresswoman. The C2, Command and Control of NATO forces resides with General Phil Breedlove, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, who's dual-hatted as the European Command Commander. And in the event of an Article 5 issue with regard to whatever it happens to be, he would have control of U.S. forces, and he would also have responsibility for coordinating our activities with NATO.
What has happened to the $75 million through this?
So the European, first of all, we appreciate that. And what we've been doing is working with our European partners on the menu of reassurance activities, the growth of a very high readiness task force, additional equipment, pre-positioning, all of which takes collaboration and coordination with our European allies. I want to make sure you know that we haven't been idle in the interim. What the
You mentioned NATO very prominently in your testimony.
Absolutely, because I think anything we do in Europe should be by, with, and through NATO, because that's the foundation of NATO's purpose. But anyway, the services have been cash flowing from their account activities that they're doing. We've got soldiers in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia right now, in Poland. Services are cash flowing it. We're catching up with it using the European Reassurance Initiative. So I assure you we have, although you may not see on the books that this money is being committed, but it will be committed.
I'll tell you, I'm befuddled by the fact that, for example, in the area of telecommunications, the Ukrainians are completely underserved. It is, I frankly don't understand it. And you would think that, you know, at least you ought to give them a fighting chance. And so I just see that particular, in the advance of Russia in many ways, setting up within some of our NATO allies' countries, new internet and radio sites in the native language, Russia, and a obvious aggressive move in that part of the world in telecommunications and other ways. I see us as very, and I understand the danger of this, but it just seems to me we could be a little more directed. And I know General Breedlove is coming up here, I think, Mr. Chairman. Right?
He is, yeah, and
All right.
I share your
So-
sentiments. We should be giving non-NATO allies support to Ukraine. I've written the president 3 times.
Yes.
We don't get any answers back, but we need some activity in that regard.
Thank you, Mr.
And-
Chairman. On the Shia and Iran, could someone address that? How do we beat ISIS without aligning with the Shia and Iran, which appears to be happening certainly in the Tikrit operation?
Well, if I could, Congressman, by the way, I think we spoke past each other in the last question. I was talking about NATO and Article 5. You were actually focused on Ukraine. We have given $100 million in non-lethal assistance. We're in active discussion right now about training non-lethal and the possibility of lethal aid, and that's an active conversation ongoing right now inside of the interagency. Shia, the real key to defeat ISIL is actually convincing the Sunni that they should not embrace this group because they have a future in Iraq. And we're actively working, our diplomats over there, General Allen, Brett McGurk, Ambassador McGurk, are working to ensure that the governance piece of this in Iraq is progressing as rapidly as the military piece of it. Because
General, if I could just insert, going to Crete, which is a Sunni tribal homeland, right, with Iranian forces and Iranian generals, is going to send a message that's going to create deep political problems, don't you think?
It could. Right now, the Sunni members of parliament and the local tribal leaders, the mayor of Tikrit, are all supportive of this because they want to rid the terrain of ISIL. You're exactly right, though. We're watching carefully. And if this becomes an excuse to ethnic cleanse, then our campaign has a problem, and we're going to have to make a campaign adjustment.
I wanted to just finally say, Mr. Chairman, as I view that part of the world, people on the ground are afraid to commit. I heard what you said, Mr. Secretary, about Afghanistan and changing people going to ISIL as opposed to Taliban and so forth. They go to the strongest force. And so if X force is the strongest, those young men will go there. At least that's my experience. So I just wanted to put that on the record. I'm very concerned about what's happening.
Thank you, Ms. Kaptur. Mr. Womack.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentleman. Congratulations, Secretary. for your appointment and your new duty. Got a couple of things. One, you said in your opening remarks, Mr. Secretary, that you, when you took the helm, that you said to the people of the Defense Department that you were going to take care of them, that you were going to keep them safe. That was, paraphrasing, that was your first priority. Help me understand how telegraphing what we will do or what we won't do in a potential conflict contributes to the safety of the men and women that are going to go downrange for this country.
Well, I mean, as a general proposition, I'm not in favor of telling people what we won't do. Let them guess. And on top of which, when you're carrying out a campaign like this, you're constantly deciding what you're going to do and what you're not going to.
The AUMF has a kind of a 3-year time frame. We've talked about the political calendar. I'm not real sure that that is appropriate, given the conditions that we're dealing with over there. But General Dempsey, you yourself, I kind of captured, were a little measured in your remarks about what we would be willing to commit to doing with regard to boots on the ground, because you specifically limited it or didn't say anything beyond special operators or JTACs. Those were the two things that you mentioned that we would consider that would effectively be literally boots on the grounds. Are we saying that we're not willing to put a brigade combat team on the ground? Are we willing not to put other types of unit force structure on the ground?
I don't consider that the AUMF limits the size of the force that we would put on the ground. Frankly, if we have to put a brigade combat team on the ground, then the campaign as currently designed has failed, because the campaign as currently designed relies on them to do the work that they need to do, that is the Iraqis and the Peshmerga and the Sunni tribal leaders. And I think that the more we can reinforce with our messaging that this is their fight, we'll enable it and support it, the better off we are.
It's been my opinion that we've telegraphed some of our military moves down through the years, and I don't know that that's worked to our advantage. You also said, Mr. Secretary, that you believe that a lot of the conditions with which ISIS or ISIL, whatever we refer to the organization, was enabled by a proliferation of sectarianism, in so many words. Did we not contribute to that? I mean, we did pull out. We didn't have a security agreement. We didn't have a status of forces agreement. We just basically left. A very popular move that was based on a lot of political promises that were made, but we left. Now, as we start this process, in the middle of the process of drawing down in Afghanistan, we've apparently changed course just a little bit. Maybe we've had some lessons learned. Is that true?
Well, sectarianism is the reason why ISIL was able to overrun Western Iraq, and the fact of the matter is that the government of Iraq, in the way it governed and the way it managed the military over the last few years, has fueled sectarianism by driving out competent leaders, by certainly appearing to the Sunni tribes to be biased against them. That is the legacy of the last few years. Now, you asked, I mean, if I contrast it with the situation in Afghanistan today, where I just saw President Ghani, they are asking us to stay. They have signed a bilateral security agreement. We did not have a bilateral security agreement. But the critical factor was sectarianism under the previous government of Iraq. And this is why, in response to an earlier question, I said we've really got to watch this very closely, because this is, and I think General Dempsey said we'd have to rethink the campaign under some of these circumstances. This is why we need to watch very carefully what's going on in Tikrit. It is true that their Sunni leaders have expressed support for what's going on in Tikrit. That gives me some visibility into the multi-sectarian nature of this particular offensive. But this is something we really have to watch because it is the key to getting control over territory of Iraq again and getting these guys, this ISIL thing, defeated.
I thank the gentleman.
Better be watching Iran and the Quds Force, too. Yes, Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Bad backs are awful things to have to deal with, so thank you for sucking it up for us here. And I know Ms. Granger mentioned that this is a moment for you and you're uniquely prepared, so I looked at your history and I was reading through, and I'm not sure if she was referring to the fact that you have a bachelor's degree in medieval history, and that makes you uniquely prepared to deal with the United States Congress. There are, with the presidential request, the budgetary request, I'm just looking through the procurement and modernization programs. 57 Joint Strike Fighters, $10 billion. 16 P-8 Poseidon naval surveillance, anti-submarine warfare aircraft, $3.4 billion. Hawkeye aircraft, 5, $1.3 billion. 9 ships for $11 billion. A bunch of retrofitting, overhaul refueling of USS George Washington. R&D for Ohio-class replacement, $1.4 billion. KC-46 tanker, continuing to develop that for $3 billion. Long-range strike aircraft development, $1.2 billion. Ground-based interceptor reliability improvement, $1.6 billion. These all, to me, seem like essential needs, given the fact that I've been on this committee for a few years, was on the Armed Services Committee, have seen the deterioration of our capabilities in so many different ways. The issue, we don't have any money. And so part of it is to try to get the message out of exactly what's happening. And I don't think any of us have done a very good job communicating to the American people that these needs are essential for us to, all these questions that go up and down the line, Iran, ISIL, Ukraine, Syria, on and on and on and on, are all urgent needs. And we're in the middle of all this, and we don't have the dough. So part of this has got to be, for us, at a moment where we have a huge concentration of wealth in our country, and you can't have this discussion without having the broader discussion of where are we going to get it. But I think if the American people knew exactly where we were and the road we're going down, I think it may be easier for us to make an argument for how we maybe generate the revenue and make the cuts primarily to help make this happen. One area that we're working on in my district's in Youngstown, Ohio, which is the President's first Additive Manufacturing Institute. Seeing that we have made some investments with the Air Force program, Youngstown State University, University of Dayton, with America Makes, I'm seeing huge possibilities for cost savings with the military making the kind of investments needed to drive down costs for procurement and replacement parts and all the rest through these investments in additive manufacturing. If you could talk to that briefly. And then another question, I'll just throw them out at you now so you can kind of hit them both. The defense industrial base, and I know that does hit your background, the STT2 study. Is this something that, sector by sector, tier by tier, is this something that's going to continue? To me, we're spending a lot of money. How do we keep it in communities that we represent to make sure we have the supply chain available and qualified to deliver the kind of equipment at the quality that you need it? So additive manufacturing, America Makes, and the supply chain.
Very, very briefly, the defense industrial base is a critical. It is next to the excellence of our people in uniform what makes our military the best in the world. And that's not something you can take for granted. The way we do things in this country is we count upon the private sector to provide us with technology and with systems. And we need to make sure that we continue to be supported by a robust industrial base. That is a concern and a preoccupation of mine, and I share that absolutely with you. Manufacturing institutes are an example of a step we're taking to make sure that excellence in production remains part of our defense industrial base. Additive manufacturing is one new type of manufacturing. And of course, it's related to the bigger question of making sure that America's role in the world economy remains a leading one, a strong one, and one that all of our people manage to share in. So it's got a bigger national purpose, but for us in defense, it's in order to make sure that we continue to excellence in production.
With the ST2T study, do we have status and outcomes that have come from that? What their weaknesses within the context of how we evaluated what's happening, and what can we do better?
There are, and just so to define that study, that was a study that tried to look at the tier-by-tier part, which is the prime contractors and the subcontractors, part suppliers, and so forth, as well as different sectors, aerospace, shipbuilding, and so forth. The tiers are relevant because you can have a situation where the prime contractors are very healthy, which in general ours are today, but down at the lower tiers, there is a diminution in number of suppliers, technology competence or sophistication of the supplier base, and so forth. And that was that is something that was uncovered by this study, and therefore something also of importance to us.
And I'm running out of time, but I'd love to talk.
You actually have run out of time.
Happy to.
I see that red light on there, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ryan. Judge Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome. Secretary Carter, I like your name, and hope you're very successful. So if you are, I'll go back to Texas and claim you as a cousin. General Dempsey, good to see you again. Thank you for your service. I'm all about the soldier, the ground forces. I've got Fort Hood in my district. We talked about it. I think it's been made clear. We know your position on the president's budget and the numbers, but BCA is the law of the land. And therefore, if we exceed the caps, we're going to be talking about sequester, which I hate, everybody at Fort Hood hates, and everybody in my district hates. But I need to know, I'm curious. Our current national security strategy, it's flexible, but is it flexible enough in light of what we may be facing with BCA that we will have, and what is the strategy that you envision, and either one of you can answer this, if we have to cut the Army and the Marine Corps to an unacceptable ground force? And I think we're verging on the edge of that, in my opinion, right now. And then I want to point out, and I think you all know this, you don't just go out and hire sergeant majors, and you don't just go out and hire lieutenant colonels. We're hollowing out the force, and the concern that what is this strategy about that real problem? And I learned about something from folks at Fort Hood called Task Force Smith, and we don't want any more Task Force Smiths. So I want to know the plan if we're in that situation. Not, we need more money. We know you need more money. But what's the plan if we have to be there? Because I'm worried about the individual soldier.
You should be, because that's one of the consequences of a budget reduction as rapid and as sudden as called for by sequester. Task Force Smiths was an example, an historical example of troops being sent into battle who were not ready and were not adequately trained. Right. We never should do that. That's an unconscionable thing to do. You mentioned attrition among some of our very best people because the force is having to downsize. Another casualty that cannot be quickly reversed of the suddenness and severity of the cuts of sequester. The connection to strategy is this. We are going to have to go back to our strategy, and the time for squeezing is over. We're going to need to look at our fundamental defense strategy and our national security strategy and ask ourselves difficult questions about what we can't do or can't do to the extent this country has become accustomed if we have sequester. That's the warning that I'm trying to sound, I hope is understood and heeded, not just here by people who are yourself, who are expert, but by the country as a whole. Let me ask General Dempsey to join in.
Yeah, real briefly, sir, because we've worked this for 4 years, the chiefs and I. And in our current strategy, we've built in a degree of simultaneity. We can do more than one thing at a time. So the first thing that begins to erode and disappear is simultaneity. We're going to be less likely to be able to do more than one major thing at a time. Secondly, I mentioned in my opening remarks that right now our paradigm, if you will, for the deployment of the force is that we try to have about a third of the force forward deployed to shape events so that we're not reacting but rather shaping. And that's going to be reduced by, we think, by about 40%. The last thing, and if you want to plant something in your head on this, I'm going to guess that you're probably a Longhorn football fan. I'm just guessing.
That's questionable. Well, go ahead.
Or were you an Aggie fan?
Texas Tech, but that's all right.
Okay, so
You didn't do your intel before you came.
Yeah, I know.
Judge Carter is a very tricky man.
Oh, a Red Raider fan, but I'll tell you, the analogy works nevertheless. Unlike football, where teams love to play a home game, our job is to make sure that everything we do is an away game. And I'm telling you, Congressman, we're at risk of starting to play a bit more of a home game than we should be comfortable with.
And that was the reason I was asking, and I knew the Pentagon does scenarios where you worst case scenario situations, and I've talked to General Odierno about that. But I want to make sure you're planning for it, because until we fix the Budget Control Act, we're not going to be able to do much with what we got. I want to make one more suggestion to you on the medical issue that I've been here for all this too. I come from a high-tech area of Texas where we have a lot of techies. And I've talked to some folks, and they say that one of the big stumbling blocks between DOD and the VA is nobody wants to go to a modern platform, IT platform. They're playing with Model A's and Model T's and trying to put new engines in them, when reality is they need to have a Cadillac and a Lexus, and they are available. And if you could break that culture that says we want to fix what we got, not replace it, you might find it will be cheaper and it will work better.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ruppersberger.
First, General Dempsey and Secretary Carter. Secretary Carter, I think you're the right person in the right place. Your experience, you seem to know what you're doing, you're focused, and you're a good leader. And we hope we can work with you. I'm going to be redundant here, but I think it's important to say, because I think the American people need to know how serious we are in providing national security to our country. We have had, in the last couple of hearings, the secretaries and head of the Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force, all talking about what this sequestration is doing to us, making us weaker. We know it's a law. And I'm calling out to leadership on both the Republican and Democratic side to focus on this issue, to try to find a way to repeal this law. If the American public knew what the testimony was in the last week about how we're weaker in the area of dealing with terrorism, dealing with cyber threats, dealing with Russia-China threats, dealing with space threats, I think the American people would be very upset at all of us for not doing something to protect us. You know, we had a good bipartisan yesterday vote on Homeland Security, and that's just the beginning. This is a bigger issue than that as far as what we're doing to protect our country. Now, I got something from staff here, Associated Press article today saying China to boost military budget by 10%. You have India increasing 11%, and this is when we have so many threats in this country, probably as dangerous as this world has been in a long time, probably since World War II. We're going the wrong way, and we need to turn that around. So I would hope that we could deal with that. Now, I want to get in real quick, and then the chairman's going to knock me out as soon as my time is up. The issue of cyber. You talked about a cyber bill. We have a legislation that passed this House on 2 occasions, and it stalled in the Senate. and we have to move forward in information sharing. General Dempsey, you talked about cyber and the issue that the private sector. What people don't realize, 80% of the private sector in this country is controlled by, 80% of the network is controlled by the private sector. So we have to work in partnership between our military, between our intelligence community, and the private sector. Hopefully we can move these bills now because the threat is there. The American public were not aware of the threat of the attacks until Sony and Target, and it goes on and on. So we have to move forward. The other thing I want to get into, though, real quick, is space. We haven't talked about it a lot, but space is one of the most important things we deal with. We are the most powerful country in the world, probably because we committed to space years ago. But now Russia and China are really gaining. They're putting money, and it's a very serious issue. Could you discuss the threats of space and what we need to do?
Yes, I'll be very quick, and then Chairman, if you want to join in. China, Russia, you talked about budget increases. There's a technological and qualitative dimension to their march ahead also. And that is concerning to us. Actually, we have some pieces I don't have time to go into here, and maybe we can't.
Also, in your answer, could you say why space is so important? Because most people don't realize how important it is.
Because it's the only way, in many cases, to be able to carry out a mission, like surveillance over denied territory, like GPS satellites, like over-the-horizon communications that don't depend upon cables. There are just things that can't be done in another way than by using space.
I just add precision, navigation, and time. Everything we do in the military, as you know, you've seen us become very precise. We're exquisitely good at navigation. And the fact that we all operate on the same clock allows us to coordinate activities. And all of that is done from space. Precision, navigation, and time are all space.
All coming back to the ground.
Absolutely. And I'll just leave this thought with you. Space is congested. It's incredibly congested. When you see images that our Space Command provides, it's incredible how much stuff is in space. It's contested, in particular, by Russia and China, and it is competitive, and we better keep up with the competition.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rufusberger. Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary General, thank you for being here. And I appreciate this very important discussion we're having today. And if I could just follow up on Chairman Rogers' comments about the request for use of military force. And I think this is a very important topic that we all need to be discussing, and it's a vested interest for each of us. And I appreciate the 2 points, Mr. Secretary, that you mentioned were important to you. In the request, there is a line that says to use the armed forces of the United States as the President determines to be necessary and appropriate against ISIL or associated persons or forces. A question for me would be, do you interpret this as providing any geographical limits whatsoever, or is it boundless?
No geographical limits, which is important.
Okay, good, thank you, that is. And then maybe another question about limits when it comes to going after supporters of ISIL or state supporters. And Section 5, and again, I don't know the answers to these, I'm just trying to understand maybe your interpretation. Section 5 says the joint resolution, the term associated persons or forces means individuals and organizations fighting for, on behalf of, or alongside ISIL or closely related or any closely related successor entity in hostilities against the United States or its coalition partners. Do you interpret that section as allowing use for military force against those who fund or support that might be a state supporter of ISIL?
I can't unpack the legal side of it, so let me kind of give a common sense answer to the question. It's important the way these organizations morph over time and the way that they associate with others and the way that we see ISIL, for example, popping up in Afghanistan really as an offshoot or I guess more accurately, recruiting members of other groups. It's important that we have the flexibility in the language there, that when we are designing a campaign to combat ISIL, people can't relabel themselves and escape from it. So I think that's the critical point, common sense point, and it's important that the AUMF that ultimately emerges from the Congress take that into account, because that's the nature of terrorist groups in today's world.
would it be important to you, and again, helping us as we craft this, as you described it, to include or make sure that any organization or group or foreign entity, government or state that supported ISIL or ISIS in any way was drawn into this request for military force? Be declarative and so to speak.
Again, I don't get into the business of crafting the language here, but I try to, once again, to give a common sense answer. We need this thing to be elastic enough that we can do our job. That's the most important thing to me. Does it allow us to do our job? And as I said before, the second thing that is very important to me is that we speak clearly to our troops. They need to hear us all saying, hey, this is really serious, and we're behind this. And that is much more important to me as a non-lawyer than language itself, as I'm sure you appreciate.
And I agree with you. We want to make sure you have as much latitude as possible. That's very important. And then that leads to just my last question to General Dempsey. It seems I recall one point last year you made a statement that struck me, and I don't know where it was publicly in the press or where I might have seen it, but you made the statement that arming the rebels or training the rebels was necessary but potentially insufficient. And that was a powerful statement, very powerful statement. Do you sense that this resolution or request for use of military force completes that sufficient criteria that you might be looking for in your experience?
I don't think that what I'm looking for will be provided by the AUMF. The AUMF really relates to literally the use of the military instrument of power. And what I was referring to was as we in fact, this is one of the things that I've provided my advice about, which is as we build this new Syrian force, for example, or as we rebuild the Iraqi security forces, there has to be a companion effort to link it into some responsible political structure, or else you've just managed to build a bunch of folks who are going to change their loyalties as the situation, evolves. So the piece I'm looking for is, what is this military capability we're developing? What does it plug into that makes it responsible over time to inclusivity and representative government?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Mr. Graves. Batting cleanup, Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize for being late. I was in a meeting with some of the budgeteers, trying to make sure that what they do doesn't.
Mr. Diaz-Balart serves on the Budget Committee. It's not a committee you want to serve on, but it does allow us to put our oar in the water. The time's yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was very grateful when I got put on the Budget Committee. That's true. Gentlemen, great to have you here. A couple little points also on the authorization of force. Obviously, flexibility is something that you want and you need, and I think, at least I can speak for myself, that's something that I want to give you. My understanding, again, there's a 3-year limit in essence, and so when we've had a lot of conversations about sequester, we were never supposed to get there, but we got there. So here's my concern. I guess, do you think 3 years is going to be we're going to be able to defeat our enemy in 3 years? I think I know the answer to that, and if not, does that 3-year limitation not send, frankly, a confusing message to our troops, Mr. Secretary, which I agree with you, we have to be to the American people, to our enemies, and to our foes, and also to our allies. So in other words, does it not limit us? Maybe we'll never get there, but...
It's an excellent point, and I think that I can't and would not assure you that the campaign against ISIL will be over in 3 years. I don't think that's the origin of the 3-year limit. The origin of the 3-year limit, as I understand it, doesn't have to do with whether we have the latitude to conduct the campaign. It has to do with the constitutional nature of the responsibility for using military force in our country, and the recognition that it is a joint responsibility of the executive branch and the legislative branch, and the recognition that in 3 years there will be another president of the United States. Not that the campaign's going to be over then, but that in view of the way our country works, and again, this isn't my responsibility, it's certainly not the chairman's responsibility, but I respect the timetable built in as one that has to do with the nature of this body and its relations with the executive branch. So as long as nobody thinks it's all going to be over in 3 years, I would dearly love that if we could do that in 3 years, but I can't predict that we can. The 3 years has something to do with something else entirely, which is the Constitution, the legal system.
And I get that, and I don't want to put you in a highly uncomfortable position, but it could be a limiting. In other words, if we got there 3 years from now, and if your job was not done, ISIL was still there, it could be then a pretty serious limitation to your ability to do what it takes.
The only thing I can say to that is I hope now that 3 years from now, people have their eyes open as wide as they seem to have them open now, which is that ISIL has to be defeated. So I would hope that doesn't occur.
Right. Again, I don't want to put you in an uncomfortable position. I believe I understand this is not your decision, but I just want to make sure that I think I got the point, which is, so you would not complain if that 3-year limitation was not there.
No, I'd have no reason to complain on the campaign side.
Right. A couple more issues.
Mr. Chair, would the gentleman yield for a question?
Yes.
Do you think we're incapable of doing a reauthorization if ISIL was a threat 3 years from now?
Reclaiming my time, none of us thought that we were going to be at the sequester. Remember, we were never supposed to get there, and all of a sudden we are. And I just think that we have to be very careful to not limit our armed services to the job that they're being asked to do. Airstrikes on ISIL, and I've read that somewhere about 15 to 20 airstrikes a day. And to put that in contrast, I learned, during Desert Storm, I guess it was over 1,000 now. Is it 15 or 20 a day, whatever the number is, because we just can't, since it's not a sitting army necessarily, that we can't find the targets? Or why those numbers? Why limit it to 15 or 20? Is it military, or what's?
We're not constrained. If I had 300 targets, we would deal with 300 targets. It's a matter of developing targets at an enemy that is a learning enemy, and they don't sit around waiting to be struck any longer. And both our coalition support, our aircraft from the coalition and I are flying close air or combat air patrols. When we find a target, we attack it.
Great, thank you. And lastly, Mr. Secretary, I would just like to join the words of Mrs. Granger. Sequester is the law of the land. I don't like it, but it's the law of the land. And if we were to mark up, as I heard today in budget, if we were to mark up at a different number, a higher number, it's fake, because then the sequester would kick in and it would just automatically take it right out. So you can't control what Congress does. Heck, many of us sometimes are wondering if we can control what Congress does. But I would just urge you it's going to require congressional action. It's going to require presidential leadership as well. And you can't do anything about us here. But I would just urge you to please, we have to get those conversations going. We have to get, frankly, those negotiations going. I don't think it's going to happen before the budget is marked up, or potentially even before the appropriation bills are marked up. But we have to have that conversation. It's going to require House leadership, Senate leadership, and it's going to require presidential leadership. So I would just also urge you to make sure that you spread the word here, what you're doing, but also that that we do everything that we can to make sure that the president also engages.
Thank you, Mr. Diaz-Balart. Just one personal comment on the authorization issue. We used to focus on Al-Qaeda, but tomorrow we may be focused on the Quds Force. So I know this is ISIL-centric, but in reality, we need to be prepared for every eventuality. On behalf of the committee, I want to thank you, gentlemen, for your time, and thank you for representing the best fighting force in the world. We stand adjourned.